Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I would like to introduce Professor Selena Anders, who is here with us. We've taken this brown bag lunch session starting this semester with her because we have this privilege of our Rome faculty being here with us this semester. And we want to take advantage of that for all the students and be able to give their knowledge as a resource to the students and faculty. The brown bag lunches are made for faculty members to be able to present their research work that they're doing this semester, to be engaged in a dialogue with the students and the faculty in the school. Professor Anders is a design professional, educator, and researcher. She teaches in architectural design, advanced graphics, and documentation of historic sites in Rome, Italy. She also organizes and teaches course in the summer program in China. It's worth visiting the next time you can. And introduces students to traditional Chinese architecture and urbanism. Professor Anders is also the co-director of the Historic Urban Environments HUE&D research team that is currently working towards the completion of the project Rome Cities in Text in collaboration with the American Academy in Rome. In addition to her work specializing in documentation of World Heritage Sites and historic urban environments, Professor Anders' research is currently concentrated on the Italian architect Giuseppe Valadier, with a particular focus on his work executed during the Napoleonic occupation of Rome. The work she's going to show you today is actually based on her PhD that she concluded at La Sapienza, University of Rome, in the School of Civil Engineering and Architecture, Department of Architectural Research, Theory, and Practice. She received her master's at University of Notre Dame, so she's a domer, and she has done her BA in art history and anthropology with a minor in Italian language and literature from DePaul University in Chicago. Personally, I have known Professor Anders now for 14 years. She has been a co-founder of my research team, Dharma, along with Professor Alve Fries, who is right there, and Jill Kapadia. She has been on numerous expeditions with us, including the ones in the Roman Forum and in India with the Mughal tombs and gardens, and has had incredible stories to share from these expeditions with me. It has helped both her and me have a professional growth together. But without any further ado, I would like to introduce and welcome Professor Anders. Thank you.
With the warm intro. So I'll just say in advance, this lecture might be a little bit longer than anticipated. I had a beautifully timed 15-minute one that I've given before. I apologize for the static. I think it's the lapel mic is on. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. But just bear with me. I will go through this as quickly and efficiently as I can, and then eventually there will be some time for ad lib. But if I do this all ad lib, I will run out of time, definitely. I turn lectures into conversations, but Professor Yunus will be very mad at me if I do that today because he's in here at 1:15. Like Professor Cruce said, this presentation is a summary of my doctoral research at La Sapienza, which I recently revisited and submitted as an article to the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. This research examines the visible remnants of medieval residential facade porticos in the historic center of Rome, revealing a distinct layer of the city's building tradition while highlighting the phenomenon of a shift in architectural and urban patterns, and as a result, the fabric of the city of Rome from the late Middle Ages to the early Renaissance. My dissertation and article essentially explore the question of what did the residential fabric of Rome look like in the Renaissance before the arrival of the Palazzo type. And one of the inherent difficulties in visualizing 15th century Rome, as noted by Krautheimer, is our lack of a comprehensive understanding of the city's residential architecture. And it's really not until the construction of the Cancelleria in the latter half of the 15th century that the domestic scale of the city begins to glean critical analysis by architectural historians. And so you can see the juxtaposition, even though you have a looser sketch and an actual photo of the Cancelleria, the sketch is showing you what the fabric would have been like around the time that the Cancelleria was being built in Rome. Yet before the Cancelleria and the arrival of first examples of palace design inspired by those in vogue in Florence, a signature feature of Rome's streetscape was the facade portico. Renaissance approaches to palace design in the 15th century in particular and 16th centuries, coupled with city planning efforts focused on the widening and straightening of streets, wholly altered the medieval fabric of the city that we know and love today, as is visible from the pages of Martin von Heemskerk's sketchbook that we see here, where he depicts both the medieval fabric of the city and new approaches to residential architecture. So the existing fabric was more like this, and then he was on to new and inventive things, which are here. So both of them reside in his sketchbook together. And, oops, that went one too far. This research, again, examines these visible remnants. That's what I started with before I started to find more in historic archives in the center of Rome. So this is just a documentation of my measured drawings of the existing buildings that I found. And it started off with me and a couple of students who were excited about medieval architecture in Rome. And we took a map and we took each rione of Rome and started documenting, measuring, and drawing what we found. And in some cases, it was a little bit more difficult because they were just little fragments here and there. And then eventually, those that documentation coupled with finds in archival documents held, especially at the Archivio di Stato di Roma and the Archivio di Segreto Vaticano, started to help me understand what was happening in terms of residential architecture in the late Middle Ages and at the onset of the Renaissance. And so these are some of my plans, actually, that were developed from the historic plans. And there were these wonderful, these plans come from a series of books called the Libri delle Case of Rome, so the books of houses of Rome. So it's basically tax documents and the plans of like the then current owner, and like noting the then current owner, how many rooms they had. And really, this isn't done as a work of art, but more so to administer taxes and bureaucracy. But for me, it helped a lot to understand what was happening in the evolution of these houses and this housing type and its eventual disappearance. But Renaissance approaches to palace design, as I was saying before, in the 15th and 16th centuries, they did focus on widening streets. And you can see how these projections into the streets, this is one of the most famous ones, later referred to as the Osteria del Gatto Nero. So Professor Rowland would really like this one. This was actually on a street when the Pope returned back to the Vatican from the Lateran after taking the seat of St. Peter's. He would pass down the street, and it was a cumbersome intersection because this projected into a very narrow street. And this is not far from the RGG, where we're located. The School of Architecture is located in Rome. But these developments led to the widespread closure of facade porticos of private residences and their eventual internalization of semi-public space into the courtyard of the building. And this transformation permanently altered the physical and social fabric of the city and its relationship with domestic architecture in particular. Now, porticos weren't just something that were common in Rome. As many of you who've been to Rome and studied there your academic year, you know that they were a common feature in northern and central Italian cities, especially during the period of the free communes from about 1080 to 1380 AD. And they defined the urban landscapes of various cities, those as diverse as Rome, Florence, Bologna, Padua, and countless others. Porticos lined the surfaces of city halls, created open galleries along piazzas, they framed public market spaces, covered the facades of private residences of wealthy citizens, and as the scholar Kim Sexton has noted, they were essential tools in communal Italy for carrying out visual campaigns and for framing formal rituals of self-rule that suggested administrative transparency to the people, which makes a lot of sense. And similar to Florence, the transformation of Rome's urban landscape and the loss of the residential portico was a complex process that was the result of several factors, including innovations in architectural theory and practice, thank you Alberti, coupled with changes in legal structures and political authority. And by the first half of the 16th century, porticos along the facades of civic and residential structures came to be seen as an architectural symbol of republicanism in both cities, like Florence and Rome, where and they were almost entirely erased from the urban landscape. A few examples of porticos built in the 16th century exist in Rome and include the Palazzo Massimo alle Colone and the Palazzo dei Conservatori. And thankfully to recent scholarship, they're starting to find that Michelangelo was actually quite forgiving, or forgiving is the wrong word. He was quite interested in maintaining the character of the portico that existed in the Middle Ages in the Palazzo dei Conservatori. And this is a great drawing that shows the comparison and scale of what that building looked like before Michelangelo's intervention and following it. Recent studies have also illuminated the symbolic importance of porticos and their role in framing the spectacle of daily life in medieval Italy. So it's not only in the Baroque, let me go back. It's not only in the Baroque that Italian cities were stage sets for great activities. At the domestic scale, facade porticos provided covered space for the sale of merchandise, the protection from the elements, as we've all felt in the city of Bologna. And they also celebrated the families to which they belong. They served as placeholders for the displays of coats of arms of the building's owner, alongside those of allies acquired through marriage. And based on evidence from Florence and Rome, the scholar Charles Burrows has shed much light on the way the law impacted late medieval social spaces, including porticos. And Burrows underlines the importance of residential facade porticos in the Middle Ages as spaces of arbitration that served as symbolically charged visible settings for the transactions delegated by notaries, which you can see here. And look, they're almost always shown with a loggia or a portico behind them. And they also, these notaries, like if someone stole something from your house, you would be able to get a notary and solve the problem underneath your portico on the streets. Or especially there was a ceremony in Rome after marriage. They would reenact the rape of the Sabines, so the bride would be forcibly pulled into the house in a more theatrical way, and it was to show the union of the two families that probably were fighting prior to this marriage. And then there was a whole ceremony of dance that went along with it. But the portico wasn't just an architectural feature, it was an important feature of social daily life in Rome itself. And Renaissance architects in the 15th and 16th centuries started to seek to transform this appearance of medieval Rome. And they were breaking with longstanding architectural and urban traditions, including social ones, that spanned from antiquity to the Middle Ages. And in so doing, they forever changed the character of the city itself and the social structure of the people who lived there, especially native-born Romans. The arrival of innovations in Florentine palace design, coupled with new street regulations set in place by Pope Sixtus IV, served as the groundwork for veiling the medieval appearance of the city, and in particular its residential architecture. So this, to the left, are buildings that were more common to the Middle Ages. This is a tower house and compound in Piazza Margana. And then we have Bramante's Palazzo Caprini. I apologize in advance. This palazzo is going to come up more and more throughout this presentation. You'll be tired of it by the end, but it really was transformative for Rome. Now, Stefano Infessura, he was a humanist, historian, and lawyer, famously chronicled this change in attitude towards the use of porticos in the center of the city during the second half of the 15th century. And what Infessura writes about was of an event that took place in Rome following a cavalcade through the streets of Naples during a state visit of the King Ferrante of Naples in 1475. And after visiting the most famous monuments and churches in Rome, Infessura recounts that the king remarked to Pope Sixtus IV that he would never have control over his city until the porticos, projecting loggias, and other obstacles to movement through the narrow streets were removed and the streets widened. Sixtus IV was known for transforming 15th century Rome through numerous public works, and is often referred to as Urbis Restaurator or Urbis Renovator. So the restorer and renovator of Rome. Now, this is not an image of that cavalcade. It's just an image of a cavalcade that's depicted. This is actually the life of St. Augustine, and you can see Rome in the city, or the city of Rome in the background here. It's contemporary to the time. It was painted around the time of Infessura's account. And if you take a peek in, it's probably one of the best representations of Rome in late 15th century. This is, again, Benozzo Gozzoli's fresco cycle in the Alps that's located in San Gimignano. You might remember it from our visits, for those of you who've studied in Rome already. But it's just a placeholder to give you a sense of when Infessura was writing how Rome was represented. You have the Araceli there, the Pantheon, and various other churches and tower houses, pyramid. But Pope Sixtus eventually widened important streets in Rome, in particular the Via Papalis, one of the most notable processional routes in the city from about 1475 for that Jubilee year. And beginning at the Vatican, it began at the Vatican and then passed along the Via Sacra, the Ponte Sant'Angelo, continued past Piazza Navona, and eventually terminated at the Lateran. And in 1480, he imposed legislations that allowed for the exportation of private property for the public good and the demolition of porticos in particular. So many existing walled-in porticos identified in the study, coupled with those in 15th and 16th century notary documents at the Archivio di Stato di Roma, reveal that there were numerous porticos along the Via Papalis in particular. You can see some of them up here. And in addition to large-scale urban interventions aimed at widening streets and demolishing or walling in porticos in 1481, I found an existing document from the period that denotes an owner's concern with maintaining their own facade porticos. So there was a request, it still exists, of an owner of this house, and basically this is what the house looks like, not currently, on Piazza Campo Marzio, number 5 through 6. And the owner of the house, Mario Alessandrini, submitted a request to the Maestri di Strada. So the Maestri di Strada were basically the urban planners of Rome throughout a long period of its history. And he asked for permission to close the portico of his residence because vagabonds increasingly occupied it. So we have documentary evidence from the time, from Infessura and actual local Romans, that the porticos were becoming increasingly problematic for how they were being used. And so even citizens were concerned with closing up their own porticos at the time. Construction of the Renaissance palace type in Rome corresponds with these newly applied civil statutes by Sixtus IV, and adhered to the city's late 15th century idea of public decorum. As a result, the approach to the design of domestic architecture internalized the semi-public space of the facade portico into the highly organized colonnaded courtyard. And Charles Burroughs again points out the conscious planning of the courtyard and its colonnaded interior alludes to the idealized space or even substitute for urban space, as Alberti notes in his conception of the courtyard as the domestic scale counterpart of the forum on the larger scale of the classical city. And removal of the central area between the public and private space from the street into the palazzo began to change the relationship of residential architecture to the street or the piazza that it flanked. Few residential porticos were actually designed and constructed in Rome during the Renaissance. Two of the most poignant examples, built in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, are the Casa di Fiameta, the house of Fiameta's Little Flame, and the Palazzo Massimo alle Colone, which many of you are familiar with. The Casa di Fiameta once belonged to Fiametta Cassini. She goes by a number of different names. Her claim to fame was that she was the most celebrated courtesan of Rome from 1479 until her death in 1512. And Fiametta inherited this house and two other properties from Cardinal Jacopo Amanati Piccolomini, including this house and two other properties from that are located, one just around the corner on Via dei Coronati, and in a piece of vineyard near the Vatican at the Porta Vidi d'Aria that doesn't exist anymore. The Casa Fiametta, with its 15th century portico, is located at the intersection of Via della Maschera d'Oro and the Via dei Acqua Sparata, and it faces the Piazza Fiametta, so named after the building that's there. And it was restored in the 20th century, altering some of its original features, but it still remains a curious example of a residential portico in Rome. The building represents a transformation of the pre-existing facade porticos of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, with using the model of the Tuscan Doric porch that you can see here. But the building's most particular feature is the use of spolia, that can be seen projecting from three of the four corners of the building. So this is Via Maschera d'Oro. Via Maschera d'Oro was one of the most beautifully painted streets in Renaissance Rome. It's in Vasari's Lives of the Artists, and he refers to all the exquisite fresco paintings on the surfaces of the buildings. So what most likely happened is that this was a medieval facade portico on that important street, and then in the Renaissance it got a bit of a facelift and got this wonderful porch, but it's still keeping in character with that. And around the corner, the other property that she owned, this building is this. Around the 1930s, some of this was stripped away, and they were able to find the remnants of the portico, but now it still exists, and it's just interesting in Rome. So many layers of the city are not just underground, but vertically accumulated, as you can see here. So all of this is filled in, but the portico still exists and resides behind that surface. And the only 16th century Roman residence that incorporates a portico into the principal ground floor facade is the Palazzo Massimo alle Colone, which is still occupied by the Massimo family today and is located on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele II and along the Via Papalis. And the Massimo, actually, I wanted to breeze over this, and when I submitted my journal article, the reviewer was like, no, you need to expand upon this. I'm like, this building is one of the most well-written about buildings in history. What am I going to add to it? But that person was correct, because I did find out very interesting things, and it pretty much helped me gain a new appreciation for this well-known building. But the Massimo family was one of those families whose homes was pillaged and destroyed during the sack of Rome in 1527. And after Principe Domenico Massimo died, following this tragic event, his remains of his properties were divided amongst his three sons. And his eldest Pietro commissioned Baldassare Peruzzi to rebuild his portion of the urban block that belonged to the Massimo family since the 12th century. When Peruzzi received the commission to design a new palace along one of the most ancient and significant streets in Rome for one of the most distinguished members of Roman society, his task was not a simple one. Peruzzi rebuilt on the site of the family's original Domus Antiqua del Portico, so the ancient house with a portico, comprised of several residences and a tower house. And the house that was attached to the tower is cited in archives as having 4 columns along its facade. According to Valeria Caffa, who's a scholar who wrote a monograph on the Palazzo Massimo, a free passage extended through the Domus Antiqua that connected the Campo de' Fiori to the Piazza Navona, creating a continuation of the Via del Paradiso through the family's private property. At the time of Peruzzi's intervention, residential porticos were really out of fashion, and in central Italy in particular. And in Rome, they were associated with the medieval compounds of the wealthy native-born merchants and baronial families of the period, especially those associated with the period of the free communes and the secular institutions still situated on the Campidoglio. Their widespread closure had begun in 1480 with Sixtus IV, as previously noted. But in addition to concerns relating to safety and changes in fashion, the eradication of porticos did another thing in the city. It also removed the visible presence of native-born Romans themselves, whose homes and compounds once prominently lined the symbolically charged Via Papalis. And they were replaced by the palatial homes of curial officials who were arriving in greater numbers in the 16th century, representing the growing authority of the papacy in Rome. So what makes Peruzzi's design of the Palazzo Massimo alle Colonne genuinely unique is that it was anachronistic. Peruzzi is both inspired by his contemporaries and drastically departs from their work. So, like the Palazzi Alberini Cicciaporci, Massimi Ossoli, Stati Materani, Caffarelli Vidoni, sorry for all the long names, but that's what they're titled. Peruzzi's work was inspired by Bramante's highly influential, again, Palazzo Caprini on the Via Alessandrino, which was near St. Peter's. So again, this building. Bramante's work introduced a variation on the Florentine palazzo type sought after by the cardinals of Rome for their new palaces, such as the Palazzo Castellesi, now referred to as the Palazzo Girard Torlonia, and the Cancelleria. Bramante's Palazzo Caprini provided a new model of palace design that included shops on the ground floor, allowing for greater transparency along the rusticated base of the palace than its more solid and fortress-like Florentine counterparts that we can see here with Palazzo Medici to the right. Bramante's design was inspired by the ancient Roman insula, incorrectly identified during the Renaissance as the ancient palace type. And this Roman variation on the palace, as Charles Burroughs proves again, that it became an influential model of emulation by patrons who were either representatives or allies of the Roman patriciate, whose place in the position of municipal authority was increasingly filled by papal officials. The economic success of the Roman patriciate was tied to the surrounding countryside. As Burroughs eloquently articulates, they prospered thanks to this transhuman system that was controlled by the bovattieri, or stockmen, who had their guilds situated in the Palazzo dei Conservatori on the Campidoglio. And all of this, in a nutshell, is basically the native-born Romans were being pushed out by the greater visible and physical presence of the papal officials that were returning in greater numbers and settling in Rome. And many of them were tied to agriculture and were merchants. And they wanted to find a way to anchor themselves and not lose their positions that they had acquired in government and as merchants in the city. So Peruzzi's unique design took Pramante's Palazzo Caprini and its republican sentiments of the Roman patriciate one step further. He maintained crucial elements of the Massimo family medieval compound, including its ground floor portico and passage through the building, essentially providing an unencumbered public thoroughfare between two of the most important urban market spaces in Rome, in Renaissance Rome, the Campo dei Fiori and the Piazza Navona. He symmetrically aligned the palace's facade with the Via del Paradiso to underline the family's benevolence and transparency by inviting the Roman public to continue to access their private property. Peruzzi revised the use of the Doric order, bringing it to the ground floor rather than placing it on the piano nobile, ennobling the ground floor and public realm rather than the private one above. And for all of us who've studied the piano nobile level, I mean, it really is quite drastic to have all the beautiful articulation on the ground floor, and then it's more simplistic on the piano nobile level. So he's giving the power to the people, not only in terms of passage through the place and maintaining his transparency as an important member of society, but he's also giving them the decorative realm. And I could go on about this, more about their symbols of Hercules in there, and there's citations of specific buildings in the Roman Forum that they used to underline the fact that, like Hercules, they conquered over someone who tried to steal their property, and they maintained their space in Rome. And then also the person who commissioned this building, the member of the Massimo family, Pietro, he also had a hand in the first commission of the redevelopment of the Campidoglio and maintaining the portico there. So there's a lot happening in terms of the history and visual and physical manifestation of porticos and what they meant to native-born Romans, but that's for another article and another time. So essentially, what happens if we go back to the Middle Ages and looking at the porticos, what I did was I took the Noli plan and started to map out the major streets historically that have still maintained, for the most part, their sequences through the city. And then on top of it in red are the locations of the porticos that are still standing today in the center of Rome. Then I went a step further and started to add ones that I found and I was able to actually locate from archival sources, which is really difficult because many libri delle case, they tell you who the owners were and what neighborhood that they were located in, but they don't always tell you the street because Roman street names came, the major quantity of streets weren't really named until the beginning of the 19th century. And together, the idea was that if I map one building type in Rome, that eventually other medieval building types that are more well-known, like the Palazzo Taverna on Monte Giordano, or the Mattei compounds here at the edge of Trastevere, if you start putting them together, you can actually start to visualize what medieval Rome looked like, which most scholars step away from because they say, oh, the buildings are too over-restored, you can't really tell what was happening. But on the urbanistic side of things, it helps you understand where major marketplaces were, where more of the activity in the center of the city was. And it's quite helpful to map things. This is one of the first rounds of maps that I made locating the Portici, and on here there should be 54. I actually found 2 more, so it should be 56. This needs to be updated, but it starts to help you understand where these clusters were located. And it's not surprising that close to the Jewish ghetto, there remains more than in other neighborhoods, and that's because that neighborhood really wasn't touched. There wasn't major palaces. I mean, things changed over time, and they accumulated and went through ebbs and flows, but it wasn't as massively changed or interrupted as other parts like the Via Giulia or other major urban areas of Rome. Another aspect actually that came out of this that I didn't expect was the proliferance of the use of the Ionic capital, and some scholars say that in Rome in particular, the Ionic capital was used quite a bit because starting with Constantine and his renovation of the Temple of Saturn, he starts to use Ionic capitals a lot in renovation. And this is a capital that a number of scholars think was once on the Portico Massimo in Rome, and you have the symbol, the Christian symbol, so on a majorly charged pilgrimage route, basically going towards St. Peter's. And in the documentation of the porticos, I found that the systems of porticos either land on unadorned impost block or highly articulated Ionic capitals. So it's something very particular. If we look at other cities, even Tivoli, the columns, capitals are used like various parts of spolia, so it could be a Corinthian capital from an ancient Roman building. In Rome, they use all the good capitals, like the Corinthians, the composites, and the beautifully designed ones in the churches. But they were also fabricating a lot of Ionic capitals in the Middle Ages. So you start to understand also the different productions and can start actually associating them with different workshops based on the ones that exist in churches built during the same period. When I started this project, it was more about thinking at the urban scale and mapping the evolution of Rome's urban fabric through time. So this is the street of Santa Maria dei Monti. This is the church of Santa Maria dei Monti. And I started with this building and documenting its history over time. And surprise, surprise, in the archives, I found what it looked like prior to 1526, what it looked like after a restoration by Martino Longo. And this is what it looks like today. And I couldn't help myself. I added Francesco Totti and the graffiti that exists. But the great thing is that you can see the evolution of a single building. And now this is not a palatial building. There's more documentation on this building than some of the palazzi that we know and love in Rome, which is kind of fascinating. And I started to find out how it was attached to a greater system of porticos. So this is that first one on Via Santa Maria dei Monti. From a historic archive, I found one that most likely this is a little column, might have had another arcade continuing. This building, it wasn't documented, but when you turn the corner, you have that Osteria del Gatto Nero on the Via dell'Agnello. And for whatever reason, Danish artists in the 19th century loved that building. Probably because it's the only one that maintained free passage under it through basically into the 19th century and until the Via Cavour was constructed, which runs now right around the corner from it. But Ernest Meyer he's a Danish artist working in Rome in the 19th century, and he uses it over and over again, and he just mirrors it, and he puts it in so many of his paintings. If you're ever in Copenhagen, you've got to see Danish artists working in Rome in the 19th century. They are the complete opposite of all other artists, like the French artists looking at the ancient Roman ruins and its grandeur. They love Roman daily life and like the messiness of it, which is quite fascinating. So if you go to Copenhagen, check out Ernest Meyer and the Danish artists in Rome, because they'll give you the other side of the story of what was happening there throughout its history. The other find from my research was after documenting and mapping all of these, I started to find out that there was quite an organized structure of the porticos. So there was a trabeated one that manifests itself. Now this is new additions over time. I can't believe this medieval structure with ancient spolia is still holding up all of these buildings above, or levels above. There was the arcuated type, a tower house type, and the most recent, or the youngest of them being constructed into the 15th century was the townhouse type. And I almost rented this apartment. And after doing this project, I'm really sad that I didn't, because then I would have known what it was like inside. But there was 4 distinct types that came out from this study, and they were very well organized. And other scholars in Rome, such as who's a classic scholar, Patrizio Pensabene, he starts to associate the time periods of these, because that's one of the big things why architectural historians try to stay away from dealing with Rome's medieval architecture, is it's hard to date. But if you attach them or link them with church construction, especially in their porch designs, you start to, or the design of the narthex, you start to see that there's periods where they focus more on trabeated, which was the most expensive. And even Alberti makes a mention, if you're a wealthy citizen, and you're an important citizen, the most noble person has a trabeated portico, and that's because it takes a lot of money and expense to procure a long, heavy piece of stone. The average citizen should have an arcuated portico because they were cheaper and easier to construct. Tower houses have their own history because they were part of a fortified period, or they had a very short life and death in Rome. There was about 318 total that existed at one time. And the townhouse, or the Casa Schiera, is the early, it's basically the early version of our townhouse or row house that eventually merged, travels through Europe and arrives in America. We have this two-bay system. And there were different variations. Obviously, sometimes you get tower houses connected to arcuated porticos, or they've been fused by various owners over time. Some of them are more ornate. This is one of the later ones where you start to get terracotta tile details. This one might look unassuming. Its claim to fame is that it's the supposed house of the Fornarina, Raphael's muse. Her house supposedly, there's journal articles, local journal articles and legends about bringing people to Raphael's lover's house because it's just like the best thing ever. But Trastevere loves historically to tout that this is his girlfriend's building. The next step is to get this on the HUE platform, so the Historic Urban Environments platform, so that not only can you explore Rome, the Renaissance and the Baroque, but you can explore the medieval character. So adding it to a website and digital platform, digital application, so you can explore Rome digitally, linking the urban, linking the buildings at the urban scale, the architectural, and even the detail. If you look closely, there's two little serpents sticking their tongues out at one another. So that was also a fun part of this project, was to discover things that the medieval masons left behind. I also linked them to ancient porticos, so I found the evolution of where the location of porticos were in antiquity, how they transformed over time. So from the Stoa to the portico of Ottavia, the arcuated portico of the Palace of Domitian is split, the Colosseum, Hadrian's Villa. Oh, and Professor Piratini gave the best one of the Mignanum. He has the best drawing still, which is more the residential scale in antiquity of a use of a portico. And then how these historically charged networks were, ancient ones were taken over during the time of Constantine, and so we have porticos that are linking extramural basilicas to the city center, and they're charged with meaning, and they're quite significant. And then how over time, later on in the Middle Ages, these large ones, this one in particular, going to San Paolo, got destroyed in 1089. They start to go more locally on the facades of churches in the form of an artex. You see the construction types that are similar to the ones that we see on the trabeated architecture, or the arcuated ones that we see on the churches here. And again, one day it will reside for you, and when you're in Rome, digitally, to access and learn more about the history of it. And more layers, urban layers. And you get the gist. But this is more of the same. My research focuses a lot on the evolution of buildings, and I didn't realize that I've been focusing most of my work on background buildings, not necessarily the star players, but the ones that tie the fabric together. And even in my work on Giuseppe Vassi and mapping his Rome, his guide to Rome in the 1700s, it's really the fabric of the city that makes it so grand. I mean, the monuments wouldn't be anything without a really good fabric. So that is where I am right now, and if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. That went a little bit long, longer than I expected. I usually I'm used to giving this in 15-minute spurts, so it's nice to have the luxury of 40 minutes.
We have 6 minutes before studio, so if anybody has any questions, or even from the Zoom call.
Selena, I have a quick question. I don't know if the answer is quick, but the question is, in the plans of the houses you showed, some of the porticos were contained between walls. In other words, they were only in front of a single house. And in other cases, it looked like they were potentially open and continuous to neighboring houses. We're all, we all know like the Portici of Bologna, which are of course continuous, and you can walk on under them for long distances. What was the relation in Rome between the portico as a private porch to a single house, and to what extent were they continuous?
Oh, there was a lot of continuous ones. That's an excellent question. Thanks, Steve. There was a number of them, like the famous ones are in front of the Trevi Fountain. They were fused together, and they would have actually allowed for a continuous passage through them, like the ones in Bologna. And in other cases, they were a little bit more private. Most of them projected onto the street, and you can actually walk through them. There's more documents that say the problem with that was that Romans just never knew their boundaries, and so that, like, even though they were given the extra space of the portico, they filled them up with their stuff that they were selling, so the people were forced to actually be in the street rather than use the portico itself. The first wave of closures actually closed the sides of the porticos. That's why you see so many in those plans in particular that I showed from the Archivio di Stato di Roma. They started with closing in the sides and then filling in the fronts. But they would have been more continuous, like projecting in the street. So you can imagine Rome more, okay, not as extensive as Bologna, but more like the ones in Bologna that you could actually use them to pass under continuously.
Thank you.
I was curious, I don't know if the 4 building types you had enumerated, I don't know if they were part of the research or if they're like something separate, but I was curious, were the tower houses, the fortified residences, able to contribute to the porticos in any way, or were they even like closed off around the ground?
Oh, at least in the one that the Casa di San Paolo, I think if I can go back without giving you too much pain in your eyes, they connected and continued the actual passage. It would have been open and continuous. The only problem is the one that I showed, the one from the Casa di San Paolo here, I'm sure it's on the other side, the one I showed. There's a big government building that completely chopped off the fabric. So, and in Noli's plan, you can see some little projections of columns. So most likely the tower house was just part of the passage through the portico, if you continue that line straight through. They were just a little bit more narrow than the ones in Bologna. They weren't as ample, they weren't as tall or as wide. But that's because they're on this street, the street that this one is on, and a number of others, it was on an ancient Roman street, on ancient Roman foundations. Even Palazzo Farnese, for example, they found a medieval residential portico that's still embedded in the walls, that's on top of an ancient Roman building, that's on top of an ancient Roman street that passed through. So Rome had different constraints than other cities, and so the space that they were working with was much tighter than you see in Bologna.
I have one question. And do you have any understanding of why the columns were so sharp?
Because they were, yeah, so most of it's what they had nearby. So once they were digging up or building on top of the foundations of other buildings, a lot of it was just what they were able to legally use. Wealthier families had taller ones, so the ones that exist along the Via Papalis are actually much more tall, and the proportions are more common with ancient proportions that we're familiar, or classical proportions that we're familiar with. But these, like Alberti says, for the average citizen, not the nobleman, it's more of procuring what is local, affordable, or what might be on your property already.
So they use folia for the columns, and then the capitals were made.
Yeah, exactly. That's sorry, I left that part out. Yes, exactly. The column capitals are almost all sculpted by medieval masons. The column shafts, which are predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly gray granite, gives you a sense of how much gray granite was available to them from ancient Roman buildings. But yeah, it was all spolia for the columns, shafts, and new carving, sometimes reuse of old bases for that. Oh, Father Wayne.
Do any of the column shafts look like they've been blocked up?
Yes, some of them do, yeah. And some of them have been from buildings that actually had interesting anchor, like metal, like appendages to them. So you can kind of tell what other building types they would have been used for. Like in the Temple of Vesta, the markings for the grills to be inserted. You can see that also.
The reason why I asked that is that if you found a
Yeah.
Very simple portico.
Yeah. Yeah, just lob it off. Yeah, they were really practical, it seemed. In Rome, they're so unified. I didn't expect it when I started to look at these buildings. They were more orderly than in other cities that I had experienced. And a lot of them, the most orderly ones, were along major pilgrimage routes, processional routes, and things like that. Yeah.
Why did the closures and porticos and stuff survive in Bologna?
Because you had the papal edicts that were coming down, so the Pope was renovating his city and making it modern. Various popes, especially from Nicholas V. And I left that part out of this discussion too. Like Nicholas V, with input from Alberti, actually planned to make a trivium leading to St. Peter's. And one street was on the side of the trivium was going to be for there was all porticos matching, same size, same scale, either side for craftsmen of the medium level. The one going dead on center with the doorway to St. Peter's was going to be for craftsmen of the highest level. And then the one facing the river, there was no order, basically porticos, but the craftsmen were of the lowest level and they could do whatever they want because they're facing the river and it's not that hygienic. In Bologna, on the other hand, they have the influence from Florence, and they start using the Florentine palace type, but they don't have the closures. There's also a pride of their historic lineage, and so they maintain their porticos and their history. They're more proud of that. Where Rome becomes a think tank for architectural design and development, like an epicenter for people to come and do that. But Bologna does get the Florentine palace type. It's just not as visible as in Rome. Oh, yeah. Sure.
Could you talk a little more about the social shift that accompanied the relocating of the portico from the external public space to the internal garden?
Yeah, and so that one is my anthropology side of me is actually quite interested in that. But since I've gone so far into the realm of architecture, I needed to buddy with someone at the University of Toronto because they're really good with the social dynamics and the history of Rome. But that part, if you imagine that the front of your house is being the place where you display who you're associated with, so like your family crest, your spouse's crest, like who you support politically, like basically the equivalent of us putting those signs, politics signs on our front lawn, underneath the portico is that. And there was also a place like what the basilica was in antiquity at a localized scale. Like if someone stole my pig, I can take them to court on my porch with the notary paid for and deal with the dispute. I'm exaggerating and making a simple case for this, but there's lots of documentary evidence that notary activities happened under the porticos of an individual's house who is asking to deal with a claim or a dispute. The marriage part is also quite significant because basically when you got engaged, it's not like you go on one knee and you give someone a ring and that's like a promise. You got a notary to do that because you're not escaping that marriage proposal, and that happened underneath your house. And so the porticos were these charged places and part of social activity, and then they go from the street and then they become more like semi-private and into the courtyard. And I wasn't there, so I can't say how quickly that changed, but just like today, there's so many change, like society changes so quickly, language changes so quickly, architectural trends change. And so for me, this is the most fascinating part, and it's part of the story that just kind of gets left behind. It's like the Renaissance happened, and it's great, and all this stuff that came before, and especially in Rome, because it's so difficult, and it's been over-restored or knocked down. But a lot of its fabric is there, and the added level of complexity of all of these native-born Romans, especially in the 15th century, they experienced Rome before the Pope came back from Avignon as in the major seat back in Rome. So they got used to being in charge of things, not having the Pope as the religious and spiritual leader, but also as the leader of the place, like the elected official of the city of Rome. So it was a really kind of dynamic time for society in Rome because they all of a sudden went from being the rulers of their own place to having to be ruled by other people from different places, not even native-born Romans, people coming from Florence and Bologna and other cities. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.